on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
I would go as far as to say, perhaps when you elevate tarot into the domain of the Kabbalah and you connect the two, tarot becomes an expression of these different aspects of God. And I would say that the different aspects of being, I like the word being a lot, the different aspects of the pure isness of what is, which includes you and everything that you are and the contents of your psyche, but it also includes the contents of the collective unconscious and all that whole Jungian level and beyond that. So, and that was my favorite part for me in my tarot studies, is realizing that, I'm looking at the universe. I'm looking at what is. I'm getting, and I can carry it around in my pocket. How cool is that?
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I'm joined by author Joe Monteleone to discuss his book, Tarot Mysticism. Joe delves into the deeper esoteric aspects of tarot, including its connections to Kabbalah, astrology, and other mystical traditions. We discuss the various layers of tarot practice, from practical divination to more profound mystical insights, emphasizing the importance of presence and being, and how tarot serves as a tool for personal and spiritual development. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Hey, Nick here. Before I begin this week's episode, I wanted to make a request that you follow or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. I know this is in the intro every week, and you just heard it. But right now, for example, the stats on the platform I use to distribute the podcast, the audio version, shows that 10 people follow the podcast in its audio form. And one of those is me. But I know I have way more listeners than that. I'm nearing 200 episodes and am not quite at 2,000 followers on YouTube yet. So if you enjoy what I'm doing here on Rebel Spirit Radio, please take a second to help me out. Subscribing or following is totally free and will only take a few seconds of your time, and it will really help the podcast grow, and I will be immensely grateful. So now, on to my interview with Joe Monteleone about his book, Tarot Mysticism. Joe Monteleone was described by the Huffington Post as a one-man band of magical thinking made reality. He is a master tarot teacher, author, YouTuber, healer, and modern mystic. He has spent more than 20 years researching, reading, teaching, and performing tarot and mystical philosophy all around the physical and virtual world. After a life-changing mystical experience, he created the Tarot Mysticism Academy, where he teaches the esoteric tarot and various mystical disciplines for personal development and accelerated spiritual growth. He also coaches professional readers and spiritual business owners in growing the practice. He joins me today to discuss his book, Tarot Mysticism. Joe, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I have been reading tarot for about 40 years now because I'm pretty old. And I was curious, I thought a good place to begin would be just a little bit of your personal background with tarot. When did tarot come into your life? How did that happen? And I thought, let's start with that.
Yeah, so it started when I was very young. I don't remember the exact age, maybe 10, 11, 12. My stepmom, she had the idea of getting a reading at this fair. It was just spur of the moment. And so we went under this little canopy and there was the reader there, and she gave me a reading, and she told me I was going to marry a woman with blonde hair, have 3 kids. None of that is going to happen. So it was totally inaccurate. I mean, maybe there's still time, but I was so impressed that she could pull these cards and just talk. So I was obsessed. I was obsessed at like 10 years old. And I started, any chance I got, I would go to the local New Age store in Red Bank, New Jersey, called Earth Spirit New Age Center. And I would get as many tarot decks as I could, started getting into witchcraft, that whole thing, had a little Scott Cunningham moment. And since that moment, my whole life has consciously or unconsciously revolved around a deep mystical curiosity. And tarot has become the sort of gateway drug into not just the occult, but mysticism in general and various
Mm.
spiritual traditions that have guided me both personally, professionally, and existentially. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's outstanding. So when you went to this fair and there was the tarot reader, was that the first time that you knew about tarot, or were you familiar with it beforehand?
I probably had an idea of it, but
Mm.
I really wasn't that familiar with it. So that was
Okay.
my
Yeah.
like real first experience of it.
Okay. Yeah. I'm always just curious where people seem to remember tarot being a thing. I think my first memory of it is, and I need to rewatch this to make sure I'm remembering correctly, but I think there was, like the stereotypical gypsy woman in the Lon Chaney Wolfman movie. I think that it begins with her doing a tarot reading for him. And I have no idea how old I was, but I need to watch that and make sure that my memory's correct. But you mentioned something that I think a lot of people may not be aware of, and that is that tarot is not just about divination. It's not just about prophesizing the future, that there is different levels to the tarot. And I thought that maybe we can discuss that a little bit. And it's difficult because there's so much. It's like there's this vast ocean in front of us. I always like to refer to tarot as a esoteric flashcards.
I
But
love that.
when did you begin exploring this other side of tarot?
Yes. So many years ago, so tarot, for a lot of people, tarot comes in waves, and it's
Mm,
definitely come in waves in my life.
mm,
But many years ago, when I was about to start a new wave of intense tarot interest, dare I say, hyperfixation, because I have a lot of those in my life,
mm,
I was reading Rachel Pollack's book, not 78 Degrees of Wisdom, not the most popular one, but her other
mm,
book, which was deeper meaning, spiritual teachings. I actually forget the
mm,
title, but great, amazing book.
mm,
And in that book, I remember going through the cards and reading about the Wheel of Fortune, and it brought up the Holy Tetragrammaton and the alchemical ingredients and all this stuff, which I later found more detail on in Paul Foster Case's work,
mm,
who created Builders of the Adytum
mm,
and or Bota, and his brilliant work, The Tarot. And when I started reading that, it was my first experience of almost like not that I was remembering the information, but it felt so deeply comfortable and so deeply important. It was almost like I was reading it and my soul was like, oh, this is what
mm.
I came for. And
Yeah.
I was so about reading the cards before that, but when I saw that, the Tetragrammaton, the math of the universe, like all of these associated ideas, it was like I was like, oh, this is it. And then I
Mm.
went down this esoteric tarot wormhole, and then then it just kept growing from there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no coming back from that wormhole, I don't think.
No. Absolute singularity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I did much the same. I had always read Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I didn't even have any of the variations. I just kind of stayed true to that. But I remember probably about 8 years ago, I suppose, it was when I was finishing my doctoral dissertation. I just felt this need for something else, and tarot seemed to be like shouting at me. And I remember going to the local sort of New Age bookstore in Pasadena in California, Alexandria too. And I think the deck I bought, and I think I got it on Halloween, there must have been something in the air, was the Golden Dawn deck.
Mm.
And that just led me down the rabbit hole, and I still have not come out of it. And my interest is a lot because my background's religious studies, and I love the esoteric tradition of the West. And like I said, these the tarot cards are like flashcards for that. There's this, it's a
Mhm.
library of knowledge.
I love that so much. That's such a great way to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I may have gotten that from Mark Horn, who wrote a book,
Oh
Tarot
yeah.
and the Gates of Light.
Hmm.
I think he may be the one that needs to be credited with that phrase.
Oh, he's
Um,
wonderful. Yeah.
yeah. I enjoyed talking to him. He was one of my first guests. Yeah. So the next question is really important because the your book has a subtitle. And the subtitle is The Psycho-Spiritual Technology of the Thoth Tarot. And the really important question is, how do you pronounce Thoth?
Oh, so this is a fun one. And this is where I can get a little bit, I don't know, sacrilege, but words are words. However you want to pronounce. Me
Okay.
personally, I just say Thoth because when I
Right.
saw the word Thoth, when I first
Mhm.
saw this deck on Eclectic Tarot in the 90s, and I don't know, when I was young, Eclectic Tarot was like porn for me. I just spent so many hours on Eclectic Tarot looking at all the decks. I don't know if you ever went on that site, but sampling all the tarot decks. But when I first saw it, I was just like, oh, Thoth. And so in my mind, I just said Thoth. And
Mm,
I feel like most people just say Thoth. I think,
mm.
I don't know that the true academic pronunciation. I've heard it's supposed to be pronounced taut, but then
Uh,
some people don't even say that. Some people say
right.
Tahuti. Thoth is a common one. Toth, some people
Yeah.
say, but I just say Thoth.
Yeah. Yeah, I usually do. I think I got into the habit a little while ago of saying Toth. I'm not sure, but I agree with you. However you say it, you say it. I think my go-to when I talk about the Egyptian god is Thoth. So I don't know why I would make any changes to that. Now, the Thoth Tarot is the tarot of Aleister Crowley. Crowley.
Yes.
Crowley, yes, Crowley. Sorry, rhymes with holy.
That's how I think of it too. Yeah. As
Yeah.
he said in one of his somethings, or I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of things I want to do here. And one is let's chat about Crowley a little bit and the Thoth Tarot, but also I want to look at the deeper connection between Thoth and the Rider-Waite-Smith, because the Rider-Waite-Smith is probably the best known tarot deck. I always think that if you mention tarot to someone, that is probably the deck that they think about.
Mm.
And the overwhelming majority of other tarot decks are variations of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So let's talk a little bit about Crowley because he's a controversial figure and the development of the Thoth Tarot deck, and then talk about it in relationship to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Big order.
Mhm. Yeah. Cool. Holy Crowley. Yeah, Crowley's such an interesting character, and sometimes I compare him to like the Lord Voldemort of Western
Mm.
esotericism. It's like in Harry Potter, what did Hagrid or somebody say about Lord Voldemort? He's like terrible but great, something like that. Not to be dramatic about it, but
Right.
this man had this brilliant mind and enough money to travel the world and find these rich and knowledgeable people to extract various portions of information from. He started his magical career in the Golden Dawn, and then there was all that drama, and then divorced from that, and then just gallivanting across the world, but in so doing, like putting together all of these systems of knowledge, kind of like how the Golden Dawn did, but he kind of took it a step further, infiltrating secret societies, remixing their rituals, creating a whole religion without intending to do so, like with Wicca. Like this guy's like mad and crazy, but and it's so interesting. He doesn't take himself too seriously. And yet at the same time, Crowley, not somebody I would necessarily aspire to be. I don't think like, oh, I want to be like Crowley. I want to like, I don't know. He's an interesting character. And I would say, I don't view him as like a spiritual teacher like I might like Plotinus or Ramakrishna or others, or my own teacher that's alive, but what a database of information and
Yeah.
fun stuff, really. Like so he's been kind of integral in my understanding, at least of Western esotericism, being that he's kind
Mhm.
of like a sort of crossroads of various traditions of Western
Right.
esotericism. And but for my work, I think him writing the Book of Thoth, which for many people is very hard to read, very rambly because he's pulling from so much stuff. If you can work through it, I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote my book is to kind of maybe support the exploration of the Book of Thoth and the Thoth Tarot. But if you can work through it, it's brilliant, and it's so.
Yeah.
And I do believe that Crowley writes from a place. There's portions in the Book of Thoth, I believe he writes from almost like a different place. Like I don't feel his personality on
Mm.
every page. And I'm not going to say like he channeled those parts. Maybe he did. He has the Book of the Law that
Mm.
he channeled. But yeah, so there's just something to it where, and I can't really quite describe it, but when I read certain parts of that book, it touches upon the same ineffable release at an
Mm.
existential level, as does every great text in the world. The Upanishads, aspects of the Bible, like when I read Plotinus, like, and that place that I always like to look for as a deep seeker, as a mystic, is that last moment where the words can no longer carry you any
Mm.
further. That mystics love to dance on that precipice of the mind, the very edge of the mind, where it just
Right.
has to kind of collapse. And I think Crowley tries to do this a little bit mathematically in the Book of the Law. He has this whole concept of zero, which most mystical traditions have a concept of nothingness or emptiness or zero or fullness. He just calls it like 0 = 2. But in that place, I have it's to me, it's not about Crowley, it's just about truth. So
Mm.
that's how
Yeah.
I reconcile the man with the knowledge. And even in my school, I don't try to push Crowley. In my book,
Right.
I reference Crowley a lot in the
Hmm.
Book of Thoth, but I don't push it as a work that is, all about Aleister Crowley. And
Right.
it's not even a Thelemic book. It's a book about tarot. And I have
Mm.
all respect for Thelema and the OTO and all
Mm.
of that, but brilliant in its own right and beautiful. But yeah, so
Yeah.
it's an interesting balance with him.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and your book doesn't come across that you're pushing Crowley, but he is important, especially since you're looking at the Thoth Tarot. I remember what I find interesting is that a lot of tarot readers, and even professional ones, will turn away from Crowley's Thoth Tarot because of Crowley the man. And I don't think there's any denying that he was a bit of an ass, probably not the best person to be around, but his wealth of knowledge is undeniable. And I remember thinking, ooh, Crowley, Thoth, no, 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 no. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. What am I basing this on? So I read one of his biography, Rabu. I forget the author's name. I'm hoping to get him on the podcast here in several months. But I thought, I should learn about Crowley a little bit instead of just automatically rejecting him. And then after I kind of went through that phase, I remember hearing someone say that, serious tarot readers will rely on Thoth.
Oh, I like that. That's fun. Yeah. Yeah, because yeah, and you know what? It's like I don't go to Crowley for ethics, but I will totally go to Crowley for tech, for technology,
Right.
for practices.
Mm.
In the same way that like money isn't inherently evil or inherently
Right.
good. It's just about what you use it for. And the
Right.
man has a lot of tech he put together that
Mhm.
for a lot of people it really works.
Mhm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Thoth Tarot itself and talk about it maybe in relationship to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck because they have a common source in a way in the Golden Dawn. But then how does the Thoth deck differ?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I can give two answers. I'll give my practical answer that I give my students, and then I'll give maybe a slightly more historical, contextual answer.
Mhm.
Practically speaking, I would say, like for all intents and purposes, the Rider-Waite-Smith is sort of like a scenic route
Mhm.
of the essence of tarot that was put together a la Golden Dawn. So Rider-Waite-Smith gives you these nice snapshots that are easier to work with. Easier for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, it's easier for divination because they're pictures, they're illustrations. There's a clear storyline that can be played with from those images. Now, the Thoth Tarot, on the other hand, is much more abstract. So instead of working with clear symbols that illustrate a narrative, we're working with like almost pip cards. And
Mhm.
whether it's like, 10 wands built looking like kind of like a prison cell, but not quite, it's still very abstract, or two cups with two dolphins, fish kind of figure. It's not even dolphins, but whatever it is. So it forces one to engage with abstraction, which to me is a tool to access the more subtle planes.
Mm.
And that subtle plane can be a lot of things. It can be the mind, it could be the archetypes, the imagination, a somatic experience, the nervous system, intuition, but working with ideas that are more subtle than a clear image and a clear story. So it's almost like the difference between entertainment that gives you like a clear story, like you're watching a really good show that you get pulled into from beginning to end. There's a whole sequence of events, versus going to a museum of modern art and you're sitting with the thing and there's no clear beginning or ending or experience you're supposed to have. You just, there it is, and you experience it and you interpret it. It can take a little bit more work, but in some ways the payoff is, it's more subtle, it's more nuanced, it's more almost personal. It's something to chew on for longer. So that can be a tool for people's intuition and a tool for people to explore, I think, yeah, abstraction. And also with the abstraction and its connections to, it's more explicitly esoteric, it gives people a map of the subtle forces behind the scenes that show up on the Rider-Waite-Smith. Now, that it follows that kind of historically, to my knowledge, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck was intended by its creator, Arthur Edward Waite, who obviously Pamela Coleman Smith painted it, but it was the intention of Waite to create a deck for the masses, for everybody to use. And so those images are easier to use. Whereas Crowley, on the other hand, didn't really care if this was for the masses or not. He was upholding a little bit more I would say the Golden Dawn system of tarot. Now, Crowley does this kind of thing where he just kind of gives the secrets away of whatever occult order, which is another reason why I actually like his work, is it just kind of reveals the juice that we're all wondering about. But yeah, being more explicitly esoteric, it's almost like, another way to think about it is Rider-Waite-Smith is like driving an automatic, which is all I know how to drive. But the Thoth Tarot is kind of like driving manual. Like there's more to think about, but there's more you can do. There's more, both in terms of divination, possibly in terms of magic, in terms of building your map of the understanding of reality. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you had that in the book as well, and I like that analogy. I used to have a Jeep that was stick shift, so I always appreciate the manual rather than automatic. And I also want to kind of give a little bit of a shout out to the artist of the Thoth deck, and that was Lady Frida Harris, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we incorporate, Pamela Coleman Smith and Rider-Waite-Smith, and I think we need to give Harris her due as well. Maybe we should start referring to it as the Crowley Harris deck, perhaps. And wasn't it her idea originally? Didn't she approach Crowley about it?
Well, that's the coolest thing. If it wasn't for Harris, there would be no Thoth deck. This
Yeah.
is the coolest thing. It's like Harris approached him, and to my knowledge, was the one who proposed the whole idea. He didn't want to do it. Thank Ganesha for her pushing,
Yeah.
and him finally, saying yes. I believe, she actually paid him to do that. She paid him for lessons in magic and mentoring and also to work on a deck. And so yeah, I'm happy calling it the Harris deck. I'm happy calling it
Yeah.
the Pamela Coleman Smith deck or the Pixie deck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk. I do want to get into the esoteric aspect here, but maybe the way into that is to ask you, what is tarot mysticism?
Yeah. So tarot mysticism is the area of study where tarot becomes more than just a tool of divination, but it's where tarot mysticism starts at the highest points of tarot divination and then goes a bit further. And it's almost like it's where we start exploring the different levels or layers of our being, of our existence. Now that can be as simple as, when is so and so going to text me back?
Yeah.
Does he love me, right? How's my health going to be next year? Am I going to get this job? But what tarot mysticism does is it takes those layers and takes the layer off, and it looks is what is happening in the back stages of our psyche that's permeating into this manifestation, and it explores that. And it does so through the structure of things like hermetic Kabbalah or astrology or numbers to navigate our existence, our experience in this phantom show of time and space, as Crowley talks about. Now, tarot mysticism is a term that I created to clarify that mission. It's not related to Crowley in any way, but of course it's all related. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like in the book a couple of things that you wrote. One, in terms of tarot in general, you wrote that tarot is an expression of the infinite self beholding of reality appearing as finite. And it seems to me that that is the one way to look at tarot mysticism, is that the tarot can be used to experience or better understand that infinite self.
Yeah, absolutely. So my whole thing is my biggest goal is to end suffering, at least for myself, and support as many other people in doing so. I find it to be the most practical thing there is to do, is to just lower suffering and increase joy or increase peace. And so tarot at that level becomes a refracted reflection of our infinite nature, and it becomes a scenic route towards that realization that we see in every tradition around the world, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, whether it's the Neoplatonists, whether it's where the yogis, that unaffected, constant, perennial wisdom, that existential sigh of relief that all these mystics promise in their own ways, or at least, hanker for. I think tarot can become the scenic route towards that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a list here, and I'm just going to kind of go through the list a little bit. And this is speaking towards tarot as this library of esoteric wisdom. And most of this you've mentioned, probably all of this you mentioned, but some of the things that we can find in tarot or connect to tarot, you mentioned in the book, you quote the Upanishads quite a bit, the Indian Upanishads, and that speaks to the Indian Vedantic tradition. There's also yoga and Samkhya. That's also from the Indian tradition, a bit different than Vedanta, but it's still there. We have the Kabbalah, and we'll get into Kabbalah. This is mostly hermetic Kabbalah because there are different kind of branches of it. You bring in Pythagoras, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Tetractys,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think. Yeah. There's Plotinus, the Neoplatonism, and there is also alchemy. And there is what I know as name mysticism, which is the mysticism focused on the name of God, on the Yod He Vav He, Yahweh. There's astrology. There's gematria, which is a kind of a numerology, and magic. Did I miss anything?
Wow, that list is longer than I thought. That sounds good to me, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Well,
fun.
it's yeah, well, I think it boggles the mind in a way that all of these things find expression in a deck of cards,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Hmm.
So there's a lot there. Where would you like to begin in sort of unpacking some of this esoteric tradition in tarot?
Yeah, I guess one thing I should say first ahead of time is, on the surface, I think it's important to notice that all these traditions can be extremely different. And if
Hmm.
anyone were to start studying one and then studying the other, they would see such contradictions in terms of their content, in terms of their approach, their philosophy, maybe even in terms of the motivation behind the tradition. Yet, it is my belief and that at some point there is a layer or a level where they do all become the same. And I'm kind of a perennialist in this way. I do believe they all lead to the same place, but and I teach from that approach. And the tarot mirrors the tree of life explicitly in the Thoth Tarot, but not explicitly. Both of those systems can mirror the path of yoga and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which can I also find mirror the Upanishads. But the distances between those are larger. But I would say I really believe it's all just like, you know, I'm kind of a personal growth junkie, and I'm becoming a transpersonal growth junkie. I'm always trying to better myself. And, I've done a lot of self-work over the years, but even, having created everything I could ever wanted in my life at this point, there is this itch, this existential itch right at the center that's like unresolved. And I look at that and it's like the most beautiful. It's like I feel like I share this with every person on earth. And all of our, neuroses or whatever's are just manifestations of this inner little itch. And I think when that itch is finally scratched, in a way that I can't put to words, that's where all of these traditions collapse and they agree. And that is the silence of the Zen master and all of these things. So yeah, I really do. They lead to the same place, but they're also vastly different at the start. And what I do at Tarot Mysticism Academy is we explore them in a syncretic, synthesized sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah, when I think that's appropriate, it is. And I'm always taking notes when I'm listening to my guests. So when you see me doing that, I'm just kind of like jotting down things. But one of the things I noted was it is a syncretism, that it is borrowing from all of these different ideas. And I know that there is, like in religion, my background's in religious studies. There's always this concern about like cultural appropriation and whatnot. But there is this strand, this line, and many lines, I think, throughout the Western esoteric tradition that borrows from so many different things. And it's not brand new. It's not like Crowley was the first one to do this or that you're the first one to do this. This is all going on. And it's not necessarily complete. You can't address the tarot and then come away saying, "Oh yes, I now totally understand Patanjali's Yoga Sutras." But there are relations there. There are ways that it connects. And what I noted when you were talking about that itch, and I kind of agree with you. I think there's this spiritual itch that a lot of people have, and we don't know how to scratch it. And that's where I find a lot of value in the Western esoteric tradition and in tarot, because it gives us a different way of scratching that itch, or at least trying to scratch that itch, than the more exoteric religious traditions of the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it definitely does that. And I'm so glad you brought up cultural appropriation. It's something I've been kind of tackling on, and I've had a lot of conversations with my mentor about that exact thing. And what I found is there's when you look at all this stuff, it's when you really look at, there's no like vacuum, right? There's no moment where one, group created something and it has been that way undiluted forever. Right. And it's very, there's valid criticism for, I've taught classes and I've talked about this with students, but I've had conversations with people about cultural appropriation. How do we use Kabbalah? Is it cultural appropriation? Is it not? Do you need to be, it's like, I don't know. And even Kabbalah, one of the most brilliant systems in the world, it brings in, it draws in influences from Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, and it's like it's also connected. But I'll say this: in the mystics and the teachers that I've met, the ones that at least in my mind I see them, they're sitting at the top of the mountain metaphorically. It's like there's no disconnect in their mind from any one thing and any other thing. It's all like, just, and so I take the view that whatever's, there's so much suffering in the world. There's so much neuroses, trauma, and sometimes it's not even whatever, there's so much stuff. It's a very interesting time we're living in.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of struggle, and not just with the world, but us against our own selves. It's like whatever's going to help one get to that next stage, like, do it. Someone might tell me like, oh, I have no business like studying Kabbalah as somebody who's not Jewish, but it's like it transformed my world. And so but it's an important conversation. And I will say, when we approach things through a perennialistic lens and syncretically, there is that risk of things being watered down. So
Mm,
absolutely, like when you study this, you're totally right. You're not going to get to nirvikalpa samadhi a
mm.
la yoga if you're just studying tarot. No, you have to go
Right,
to a yogi.
right, right.
Absolutely. But I think that the connections and the mirror, how similar these things start to be,
Mm,
actually validate them even further.
yeah,
They point to something that's even more real than than culture itself. It's
mm,
transcultural. What it really it's trans. It's beyond the species
yeah,
ultimately.
yeah. Yeah, the way I look at this is, especially, and I'm going to try to connect it to tarot here. I'll start with like Kabbalah. So you have Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystical tradition, and it seems to have been influenced by Neoplatonism. And there are different spellings of Kabbalah to distinguish which branch of Kabbalah. So Kabbalah spelled with a K is the Jewish Kabbalah. And then Kabbalah spelled with a Q is often the Hermetic Kabbalah. And then Kabbalah spelled with a C is Christian Kabbalah. And I don't think that it's a matter necessarily of cultural appropriation, because if you go back to when Spain was largely under the control of the Muslim Empire, Jews and Christians and Muslims all lived side by side and were sharing information. And so that wasn't cultural appropriation, that was a sharing.
Mm,
So I just wanted to say that. But the other thing is that it seems to me that the source for so much of this goes back to ancient Alexandria. We
mhm.
can connect, Hermeticism and Gnosticism. And we even have records that there were what they referred to as naked Indian gymnasts running around in Alexandria. Those are yogis.
Mhm.
And so there has always been this sort of cultural conversation that's been going on. Now, I do think that we could, recognize that cultures are always interacting with each other.
Mhm.
And cultural appropriation, I view as just outright theft.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, I'm going to take that. I'm going to start, wearing an Indian headdress and, call myself a Native American healer when I have no Native American blood. To me, that is something that would be more along the lines of cultural appropriation,
Mhm.
especially taking from a minority group their traditions and implementing it as your own.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's like my view of it is like whenever I find, I find what like if I find a teacher or a mystic that's inspiring me, there's so much love of
Mm,
the tradition that they give it. They're
yeah.
so excited. And in the same way, when I teach, I'm like, look at this thing, look at that thing, and it's like I have my students reading like the Sefer Yetzirah. Like
Mhm.
I'm all about like absolute. It's very important
Yeah.
to like respect the sources, and I think
Mhm.
following the breadcrumbs historically is very
Yeah.
important. And but yeah, absolutely, there's absolutely that line between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. In short, from an academic perspective, it's all about citing your sources.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, let's look at the esoteric aspect of the Thoth Tarot deck. And maybe the place to begin, I don't know. Well, let's just say something about Kabbalah, because it's huge and it's complex. And as I mentioned to you before we hit record, that I'll probably include some graphics so that people can kind of picture things, better. And don't want to get too lost into the weeds, talking about, like a specific Sephiroth or anything, but just kind of a general overview of the relationship of Hermetic Kabbalah and Tarot.
Yeah, totally. So Kabbalah being a Jewish mystical tradition, Hermetic Kabbalah being a sort of remix of the Western esoteric traditions. So Hermetic Kabbalah and Tarot are explicitly linked through, organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But even before then, we had our earlier people connecting it, like all the people's names that I really can't pronounce,
Yeah.
Comte de Millet and the French occultists. So in the Golden Dawn, at least, the connections are pretty explicit. So what we have are 22 Hebrew letters and 22 major arcana cards. We have 10 Sephirot on the Tree of Life, and then we have 10 numbered pit cards, ace through 10. We have 4 letters of God, the Holy Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. We have 4 court cards. So they were totally made for each other. When they met, they fell totally in love, and that was it. Well, I don't know, maybe, but there was some creative, joining of the two. But yeah, and so what this does, Kabbalah, to extremely crudely summarize it, just for anyone that has no clue about what we're talking about here, Kabbalah is, you can imagine Kabbalah as like the anatomy of God. Pretty ambitious stuff, pretty existential stuff. So, but I mean, a lot of mysticism, I would say, is somewhat of an exploration of direct connection of God, or you as God. It's that closeness. It's not as opposed to religion, which is a little bit more of a set of structures and ethics and practices. But with the tarot, what this does is, when you, and I would go as far as to say, perhaps when you elevate tarot into the domain of the Kabbalah, and you connect the two, tarot becomes an expression of these different aspects of God. And I would say that the different aspects of being, I like the word being a lot, the different aspects of the pure isness of what is, which includes you and everything that you are, and the contents of your psyche, but it also includes the contents of the collective unconscious and all that whole Jungian level, and beyond that. So, and that was my favorite part for me in my tarot studies, is realizing that, I'm looking at the universe. I'm looking at what is. I'm getting, and I can carry it around in my pocket. How cool is that?
Yeah, carrying the universe in your pocket. That is amazing. One thing I just want to say in response to what you just said is that where you like being, and I kind of do the same thing, because the name of God, Yahweh, Yod He, we're not entirely sure of the direct definition or translation. It's better a translation. We just know it has something to do with being. And and it's that when Yahweh reveals himself to Moses in Exodus, and Moses asks, who are you? And he responds with Yahweh, essentially. And it's sometimes translated, I am that I am, or it could have a different tense. I am everything that will be, or everything that was. But at the core of it is this mystery of being, I think.
Yeah, that's it. That's the mystical mic drop. And truly nothing has to be said after that.
Yeah.
That right there is, oh, it's there it is. And this is why I have become such a perennialist, is it's the exact same mystical mic drop that we read in the Upanishads, the Mahavakyas, the you are that, thou art that, Tattvamasi, the same mystical mic drop as Parmenides, who people don't talk about as much, but he was absolutely at that level. See, that to me what I call the mystical level. That's level 3, which is where it is a pure apprehending of what is, which is you. There's nothing else.
Right.
And this is the and that itch that I'm talking about. It's the last. That is the precipice of language, where that which is beholding is none other than what is, and the mirror to your own self starts to become your own self. There's no mirror, and then there's nothingness. Then you can't say anything after that. And it's so cool from a practical. This sounds, for a lot of people, this sounds very philosophical and mystical, and it's not. Like I tell people I have a mystical experience, but it's not really an experience. If anything, it's the opposite. It's the release, the relaxation of all possible experience, and from that place, there's no possible. You cannot suffer there by virtue of that isness, because there's nothing there to suffer from. So that's my favorite part of all
Yeah.
this, is right there.
Yeah. Well, it's the observed and the observer are one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, we do run up against this issue of language. And maybe that's where tarot can help us because it is something that is beyond the word. It's beyond language, you talk about this itch and what I had written down on my notes here. One, there was silence and mysticism in the ineffable. And the word mysticism, it's connected to mystery. And my understanding is that when you follow the etymology back, it goes to like one of these very old root words like mu or something like that. That means closed mouth, that
Mm.
it is something that just can't be spoken. And we saw this even in like, the old mystery traditions, you couldn't talk about the mysteries.
Mhm.
I always, the first rule of the Eleusinian mysteries is you cannot talk about the Eleusinian mysteries.
Yeah. And it's so fun because there's that stage where the language does break down, and it's one of those things you have to have the experience, it, you know, but if you see somebody, it's almost like you're ninja, or like how a thief can recognize a thief. I think Alan Watts talks about this. If you see somebody that recognizes that ineffability, who's there's like something like you have this mutual understanding.
Yeah.
I've had workshops before where I've led people through meditations, and I've had, I always try to see when's it going to happen to who, right? And
Yeah.
then
Right.
and in one of my last workshops, there was this woman there, and she got to this place, complete bliss. But after there's another stage. This is in yoga too. There's the bliss body, right, where it's like complete bliss, ecstasy. But then even after that, there's something. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and she's like, "That was the most incredible experience of my life, but I can't explain it." And it was like
Yeah.
that. And I was like, mm. And then when we have that, to me, like that, I have to, in my own journey, I have to make that the core of everything I do. It's the most important
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but
But
that's
it
what
is,
mystics do. They have this experience that is ineffable, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to put it into words.
yeah, exactly. It's like truly a fool's errand, which makes sense because this is the fool's journey. See, that's another
Yeah.
interpretation of the fool, but
Right.
absolutely zero coming into one. And speaking about words, the magician, the magus, is the word, the
Right.
logos, like
Right.
not just the language and the folly of language, but also like the word, like God being like, oh damn, now I gotta speak. All right, what are we gonna
Yeah.
talk? How are we gonna put this into words? Let's see.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of tarot trying to bypass the language through imagery.
Hmm.
So yeah. All right. So the you've mentioned okay, so Kabbalah, and the main feature of Kabbalah here for tarot is that tree of life, and it is an emanation of divinity into the world, right? It begins at and this isn't even quite right, to say it begins in Keter because there is something unspeakable above that, right?
Mm.
It is this sort of manifestation. And so you have, at the top, this abstraction, this almost platonic, otherworldly thing, all the way down to Malkuth, which is the final Sephiroth, which is this world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, how does tarot, you mentioned the major arcana. So, the major arcana is, and I'm just saying this just to make sure I'm clear. So, we have these 10 Sephiroth, and the 10 Sephiroth are associated with like Keter is like the ace, and then you can do all the rest of the numbered cards. And then there are the paths in between those, and those are the 22 paths. And those are what are associated with the major arcana, but also the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Exactly. Hmm.
Okay, perfect. So let's look at maybe just one major arcana card. And the one that I was thinking of is the priestess, because
Mm.
I always find the high priestess one of the more difficult cards to interpret. And I thought it would be a useful card to look at because, in a sense, with that tree of life, you've got these two pillars I always forget. It's like the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy, I think.
Yep.
And the high priestess is kind of like right dab in between them. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, that's really clear. So to just put you on the spot, can we talk a little bit about the high priestess and Kabbalah?
Oh, absolutely. What a great place to start. Perfect card. So the priestess is sitting on so she's sitting on path 13, which runs from Keter to Tiferet. Now,
Okay.
Keter, we know, is the first Sephira. It translates to the crown, and it's representative of the Godhead. And so we might call that a true unity, or the Pythagorean monad.
Mm,
So in that unity, there's really nothing else. There's nothing else that can be said about, when you're in unity, and this goes into the namelessness of God, or Yod He Vav He, it's impronounceable, because if you were to call God something, you'd be pointing to something as opposed to something else, which is not unity. So
mm,
in Keter, there's total unity. Now, it is an emanation system, as are many of the kind of Western mystical traditions are, maybe stemming to Plato, perhaps. And so the idea is that the energy emanates downwards into more dense forms that slowly but surely become more familiar to us in our world.
mm,
So in this path, the high priestess with the Hebrew letter Gimel runs from Keter, number 1, down the tree of life in the center to Tiferet, number 6. Tiferet
mm,
translates to beauty. Now, Keter is also attributed to the prima mobile, the first mover. Tiferet is attributed to the sun. Now, Tiferet, so if we know that Keter is unity, Tiferet represents to us, at least in Hermetic Kabbalah, what is called our holy guardian angel, or our
mm,
higher self. But the important thing here to note for our purposes, for this conversation, the higher self, as high as that self is still a lowercase s
mm,
self, meaning that it's not the unitive self, right? We're not talking Nirguna Brahman or Yod He Vav He or anything. It's a self. It's a distinguished self. Okay, so what does that mean for our high priestess? Well, it means that she is connecting unity, which is a lot to connect, right,
yeah.
to our experience as a somewhat distinguished self, a very
Mm,
higher self, but somewhat distinguished. And that path is the path of Gimel. And so the priestess represents this threshold into that unity. So a lot of people revere the priestess. A lot of people in the New Age world, especially, because she's the priestess, she's silent, she's
mm,
sitting there, she represents these mysteries, but she doesn't speak, because what can be said about moving from a self, your higher self,
mm,
into that unity? There's nothing that can be said in that path.
mm,
So she literally sits at that threshold. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, behind her is an ocean. If you look behind the
mhm,
curtain, it's a vast ocean. And how many mystics talk about oceanic bliss?
mm,
Oceanic because it's the sense of limitless, right? I was on a cruise a few months ago. I hate traveling. It was the SS panic attack for me. Oh my God. But the panic was my ego being like, oh my God, I'm in the middle of the ocean. There's nothing
mm,
for, miles and miles. But that's the vastness of the mystic. And that is the terror and beauty of the high priestess. Now, we can go even further, bring in her attributed letter Gimel. Gimel, the symbol of Gimel is the camel. So
mm,
the idea here, and this is perhaps more of a hermetic Kabbalah kind of spin, but this is the camel symbolizes the journey through the desert, which represents our journey from selfhood to non-selfhood in Keter. We go through the desert. What's in a desert? Nothing. No life, right? It's dry. It's
mm,
ironic because the high priestess is so watery, but it's the desert. And in Hermetic Kabbalah, there's something called the abyss. And when you
mm,
cross the abyss, you lose that last bit of separation as you merge into unity. Terrifying, beautiful, blissful, all at the same time. Yeah, and then so the priestess, whereas you might read in the little white book that comes with so many tarot cards,
yeah.
you might read, okay, she represents mystery, she represents secrets, she represents intuition. But what does all of that come from? It comes from her as the threshold between the self and pure being and unity, the greatest mystery of all. So
Mm,
and this is what I mean by going from level 1 in the mechanical plane to level 2 in the subtle plane. We're now working with the archetype not as something to represent like the secret that my husband is cheating on me or something like that,
right, right.
but the very secret of our own being. And we see the priestess in all sorts of mythologies, represent this secret. It's also the secret of womanhood. It's the secret of birth and fertility and consciousness coming into this, whatever this is, this unit of this mind, body,
Right.
nervous system video game, right? And the same threshold will follow at death, perhaps. I can't say for sure,
Yeah.
but
Right. Yeah, it seems to me that when you were first speaking, what came to my mind was that the High Priestess is kind of akin to Sophia
yeah,
or the
yes.
Shekinah from a Kabbalistic
Hmm.
perspective, the
Hmm.
feminine aspect of the divine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting in a lot of mystical traditions, one of my favorite books, The History of Mysticism, talks about this a lot, where the feminine is looked at as the archetype of form because, I'm not talking about now. I mean, I'm talking about historically, the feminine
Mm,
was attached to childbirth. That's not to say that, that's not like a political statement in any regard, but like
right.
historically. So the feminine archetype being attached historically to childbirth has become, she represents form, she represents our own incarnation, whereas the traditionally historical masculine input of that activity is normally invisible, so it is kind of attributed to formlessness. Now, there can be some sexism in there as well,
Mm,
totally, but
yeah.
in so many stories that tends to be upheld. Now we can write new stories and new myths to kind of
Right.
update everything, and I'm all for that, but these artifacts in the psyche are there, I find.
Yeah. There's a lot of gendered wording, language in much of the mystical tradition. I think that you noted at one point in the book, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that like one possible alternative instead of like masculine and feminine, we could look at like active and passive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, active and passive. It's and I think in terms of the tech, and by tech I mean like what symbols we're using, what
Mm,
practices we're using, what associations.
yeah,
We're absolutely not done, right? So even
right.
Crowley, like he had, many. There was a lot missing in terms of his own ethics and worldview that I mean, we're all actively updating the
Right.
work that we're here to
Yeah.
do. So, but I think, yeah, part of that's the fun, is like taking
Yeah.
taking it to the next level and being more
Yeah.
inclusive, and yeah.
Yeah. One of my guests many moons ago was Emphas Book, who wrote a book, Queer Kabbalah, where they were trying to come up with different ways of thinking about the gendered aspects of Kabbalah and everything.
Mm.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. So the other aspect here in the major arcana, because in the Thoth deck, each of the major arcana cards is going to have the Hebrew letter, but then there's also the uh, astrological sign or planet, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so major arcana will have either an astrological sign, planet, or element. Traditionally,
Right.
element, we have the three elements there. There, I know there's four, but in the major arcana, there's three, which kind of goes into a whole nother mini lecture. But contemporary astrologers, you can trade out the element for those new guys at the edge
Right,
of our
right, right,
solar system, the
right,
new
right,
kids,
right, right. Yeah,
which are actually kind
yeah,
of maybe the older kids because they represent longer periods of time. But yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, how would someone go about, again, we can look at the High Priestess here since we've been talking about that. So, you've got Gimel, which is camel, and then the High Priestess is associated with the moon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
in reading, how would you bring all of that together? Or in a mystical approach, how does that lead us to scratching that itch?
I'll start with the reading because I think that'll be more of a digestible place, and then I'm going to bring it up to the mysticism. I usually start with the mysticism, but I'm finding sometimes it's a little bit too confusing, and my mind's very abstract. So we'll start with reading. So, and this is correspondences are great. So not everybody loves correspondences. If you're a model builder like my neurodivergent brain, you love correspondences, you love models
Mhm.
and maps. Not for everybody, but if it's for it, it's definitely worth studying, in I find very important in esoteric tarot. So the moon, if you know, if you and these correspondence, you have to build in, you have to feel them. It's not just about studying them and like knowing what they mean, but you got to really feel the energy of the moon in you. And I don't mean that in an exotic way. I mean like the abstract notion of the moon. this
Mm.
body that moves through space, that waxes and wanes, that reflects light. What is that waxing, waning, fluctuation, reflecting light? So you kind of have to feel that. And for a lot of people, the moon represents intuition and passivity and fluctuation. Well, boom, there's your high priestess right there. So if you pull the high priestess in a reading and you know that she's connected to the moon, you channel the moon or bring up what you know about the moon and you say, okay, it's time to listen to your intuition, be open to change, be open to fluctuation. Notice that you are reflecting, like the moon, somebody else's energy. There's a sensitivity, there's a psychic thing going on. There's so much you can pull in just the moon alone. But now let's go a little bit deeper. What does the moon do? The moon is a satellite of Earth that reflects the light of the sun. Okay, it doesn't emit its own light, but it reflects the light of the sun. What does the high priestess do? The high priestess, as as a pathway emanating from unity, from Keter that we went over, she reflects the light of Keter. She reflects it as this ultimate super powerful feminine archetype. She reflects the energy of unity, and in its reflection brings it down to something else, right? She's like in the Vedanta tradition, they call it reflected consciousness. How we in a way that, and this is, I'm using English, I'm not using the Sanskrit obviously here, but in we all have these units of consciousness, but they only exist because they are reflecting the one consciousness that we all really are. High priestess, that's the office of the high priestess right there, right? I think it's called Chidabhasa in the Vedantic tradition. But yeah, and so yeah, that's quite a lot to represent. But it's to me, it's like that realization is the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I personally like the correspondences. When I started learning them, it completely changed my tarot game.
Yes, they're so fun. It's
Yeah.
and for some people it can be overwhelming, but like it's so like just connecting the ideas,
Yeah.
seeing because then they start to point to something that is beyond the correspondences themselves. They
Yeah.
start to point
Yeah.
to the patterns that are yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Correspondences are so
Exactly.
fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes tarot kind of multidimensional, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to see where I want to go here with this. So we've been talking about the tree of life. We use the high priestess as an example, and she's connecting two of the Sephiroth, which are, I guess, I think it was Lon Milo Duquette who referred to them as sort of like files in a filing cabinet that, each of the Sephiroth is its own separate sort of file. We've got the astrology in there. I'm trying to think of what I'm missing here. I had something and then it just kind of ran away. So until that comes back, oh, number. Would number then apply here as well? Because the high priestess would be two, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
number follows it as well. So if we were to do a quick review of our associations, we have the priestess, which is card number 2, path 13, and she
Mm,
draws the energy from Keter, the unity, the crown, to Tiferet, which is beauty. So she draws unity into the duality of the higher self. And by duality, I mean there's a higher self, so there's a second thing downwards. Now, the moon similarly creates a certain duality, being that it's reflected light.
mm.
So it doesn't
Right,
have
right.
light on its own, but it's reflected light. So there's a reflection. There's two directions happening there. And then of course the number 2 is duality. It's number 2.
Right,
So it
right,
all
right.
kind of and this happens on every card. So some cards are easier to recognize at first than others, but yeah, everything kind of starts to fall into place with all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So the major arcana how would you describe the major arcana? Because I think that's the one most people know about, but are kind of more familiar with in a sense, because it's the greater mystery, right? Isn't that what arcana means? It's like mystery.
Yeah.
They're the greater mystery.
The greater mysteries, yeah. I like to think of the major arcana as reflections or echoes of the logos.
Oh,
And the logos, if I dare to define such a thing,
yeah.
to me, it's the record scratch of the cosmic turntable.
Mm,
It's I think I'm pulling from Mel Meline in
yes.
her Magus
Yeah.
card right there. I
Right,
think she
right,
says
right.
something beautiful about, but it's that to me, the logos is the ineffable impulse of creativity. which in our conversation today, I was talking about dancing on the precipice of language. And when you're at that point, well, going into like mystical awakening, dissolving into the oceanic bliss is one thing, but the impulse to come back, the impulse to do something with that voidness, that to me is the logos. So starting with the fool, which is 0, going into the magician, the fool, total, in a sense, ignorance, but also all knowledge, whether, fool is either full or empty, either one, but it's both are 0. And then the magician is something. So the magician is something which comes out of nothing. Magician is number 1, fool is 0. So that movement of 0 into 1 is the source code of the major arcana cards. And that source code complicates itself. It's almost like a child's, inception of something, or germination, something, fertilization. That cell, that source code complicates itself in a deeper design, and it runs all the way down the majors into here we are now.
Yeah. And my understanding is that some tarot decks will have the fool at the beginning, some put it at the end, but it seems like it belongs both.
Yeah, it is that wild card. I don't know much about like the original game that tarot kind of that
Right.
the source of tarot, like Tarotchi, but I do, from my knowledge, I think the fool was that kind of like trickster card that you could play to either like pass your turn or do something. But yeah, and the elusive nature of the fool goes right in with that
Right.
cultural, that placement of, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to save the court cards for last. But the minor arcana, my understanding has always been that the major arcana is sort of kind of archetypal in a sense, but the minor arcana is the day-to-day world, our sort of lived reality.
Yeah. I would agree, definitely. At least for the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, that tends to be a good way to look at them. Of course, people might argue that, oh, let's elevate the minors at the same place as the majors, which
Yeah.
is fine. But I think, no, I think that's right. I think we need
Okay.
like one. I think that's perfect. In the Thoth Tarot, that delineation is a little bit more challenging because the minor arcana cards are actually more abstract than the majors.
Mm.
Whereas in the majors, we do
Right.
see somewhat human forms throughout, or kind of humanoid figures in the beautiful art. But in the minors, it's close to pick cards, closer to something that you kind of might see in like a playing card deck, though it's still
Mm.
beautiful.
Right.
So sometimes the day-to-day stuff is hard to extract from those, but that's where the subtle plane comes in, of using the number, using the element, using the associations, but also like the texture, the color, like
Right.
the actual sensation of the card. But yes, I would agree that the minor arcanas can tend to point towards day-to-day things, or things that are more circumstantial and kind of passing by. But always remember, I always think that still they are representative of the Sephirot. So they are still representing these body parts of God, so to speak.
Right. And so, and that's the other way to look at this is that you've got with the minor arcana, you've got the 4 suits that correspond to 4 elements, but then also correspond to the various Sephiroth, but would also connect to one of the letters of the Tetragrammaton.
Yes. So, yep. So we have each suit is an element. Yep. And generally connected to, yeah, one of the letters of Tetragrammaton. And see, this is one of the things where it's like you can either start on the bottom where it's all broken apart, like
Mm.
the 10 Sephirot or even further, or you can start at the top where it's just the name of God. And it
Right.
all comes back into being. It all dissolves in
Yeah.
being, which is Yod He Vav He. But Yod He Vav He is our 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth, but also the 4 suits. And so, yeah, all the wands are connected to Yod, all the cups are connected to He, and yeah, it all connects to being. Yeah.
Yeah. And then astrologically, the way that these work is associations with the deacons, right? So each sign is 30 degrees and a deacon would be 10 degrees of that. So the minor cards, the astrological correspondences are going to be a planet and a sign.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's a fun thing, and this is where like astrology and other typologies get very fancy, and kind
Yeah.
of like this is where it becomes kind of a poetry. Like the I Ching does this as well, where you
Mm.
have these patterns that sort of cycle around themselves to create newer and combinations to really see how many combinations can we throw at these.
Right.
It's almost like the periodic table is like the most updated version of that, but this is a more
Right.
archaic exploration of the universe. But yeah, so we have the 360 degrees of space, not space, but like the universe divided into these deacons, and then in each deacon is governed by a planet, but also a sign. So there's 36 deacons, and then there are 36 minor arcana cards if you don't include the aces. So that
Right.
means exactly each minor arcana card gets a planet and a sign, and then that relationship contributes greatly to the meaning of the card.
Yeah. And then you would look at, for example, the major arcana cards that are associated with the signs and the planets as well to help
Absolutely,
you
yeah.
kind of understand, yeah, this is the multidimensional aspect of it or the layered aspect of tarot. So I think that I want to look at the court cards because I think the court cards are I think people struggle with the court cards. They struggle with reading the court cards. And I wanted to ask you because there are differences between Thoth deck and the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And also, how do you understand the court cards? Because I think you presented in the book really interesting way of thinking about them.
Yeah. So this is a really big and fun, and it will lead into a geeky thing. So I'm not going to go crazy into it, but
Yeah.
I'll kind of give a brief overview. So the core cards in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, it's King, Queen, Knight, and Page. Now, I don't know if this is true, but there are rumors that that court card structure was decided by Arthur Edward Waite to hide the mysteries of the true court card system of the Golden Dawn. I don't know if that is true or not, but what I do know is his choice to do that does kind of contradict slightly with the original Golden Dawn system, and he does not maintain in his, at least writing in his pictorial key to the tarot, he does not maintain the associations between the court cards and the four letters of the sacred name. So, and that's totally cool because it wasn't his intention to do that. Remember, that deck was for the masses, and it works because it creates this sort of nuclear family. We have mom, dad, brother, and sister, and hopefully everybody's getting along. They're probably not. They went through the ace through 10 system. They're dealing with their element, but there they are. Very, very relatable to a lot of people. However, the Thoth deck, what Crowley does is he does maintain very explicitly the court cards connections to the four letters of the sacred name. What this does is instead of giving us a simple day-to-day relatable, court card system that shows us a nuclear family, it gives us yet another pattern of the creation of the universe. See, everything in the Thoth Tarot deck yields towards this constant pattern of how ultimately everything was created. Crowley was big with creation. Sometimes it was through his sex magic, sometimes it was through tarot, but it's all, and I think a lot of mysticism deals with these questions of why are we here? Like, why did God create this or become this, or is it appearing as this? So the court card system shows us, and Crowley goes into, in his Book of Thoth, he goes into this in more deliciously geeky detail, but he presents us this myth of how these four court cards represent God creating the world, and how it's actually how the tree of life emanates downwards. I don't know if I go super into, actually, I do talk about that in my book, that myth and what that represents. But what we have to always remember is that well, let me go to the differences. In the Thoth deck, it's not king, queen, knight, page, it's knight, queen, prince, princess. And the best way, if I were to summarize it easily, is that the knight is a card of movement. The queen is sitting still. Movement and stillness become the duality of masculine and feminine, or rather, let's say active and passive energy, positive and negative, that come together and populate reality. And that split between the movement and the stillness is that split between observer and observed that we see in other traditions like yoga and other places. So that initial duality populates the whole world with literally what we are now. What can we be sure of? We can be sure that we are aware, and we can be sure that there's something we are aware of. Well, if we go higher, we might doubt that second thing, but let's not go there right now. So there's awareness, and there's what we are aware of. That same split is that's the movement and the stillness of the knight and the queen. They get jiggy with it. They have the prince and then the princess. And so we have a creation myth. We have, and Crowley doesn't talk about this, but I believe he hints at this, and I talk about this in my book. There's a bit of an epistemological exploration here between knower and known. So it's just deeper on every possible way, this court card system.
Right.
But for everyone out there that's kind of newer to tarot, that's trying to reconcile the two, my answer is you really can't reconcile the two systems. But if you are set on doing so, what I like to do is I like to maintain that the knights of the Thoth are the knights of the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot, which goes into a whole nother lecture. And the kings of the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot to me are the princes of the Thoth Tarot. So, but they're representing different levels of stuff. Now, I would say in terms of divination, these big cosmic forces that the Thoth Tarot court card system represents, we can be sort of like embodiments of those patterns. But yeah, I'm sorry, did that answer the first question? I might have led into the second one, I'm not sure.
I think so. Yeah, the court cards are just, I know I struggle with them a little bit. And I know other people kind of struggle with them. And the distinction is between the two is, I agree with you. I think that in Thoth, there probably isn't an easy way to say, well, this corresponds to that. I mean, we can say, well, pages and princesses, but it seems to me in the Rider-Waite-Smith, the pages tend to be seen as like children, and in a sense, the princess is a child of the queen and the knight, but the princess is also, when we apply it to the Sephiroth, their tree of life, she exists in Malkuth, which is this world. And the way I've heard it phrased before is she's like the throne, I think, where you have Ketra at the top and then Malkuth all the way down to the bottom. So the princess is the final embodiment of that energy. It's that energy made manifest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's the throne of the powers of the aces. What a thing to say. The throne
Yeah.
of the powers of the. I mean, if we know, going back to our high priestess, our high priestess leads to Keter. Keter is the crown, which is the godhead. What does that mean? That means that the princesses are the thrones of the godhead. They are the embodiments of the godhead, which is funny because Crowley, I believe Crowley talks about this. I think he brings up, who is that magician? Not Pappas, but Eliphas Levi. I think he brings up Eliphas Levi's discussion on elementals, right? So elementals are this occult thing where it's like, in fire, you might find a salamander who's a true manifestation of fire, right? Well, these princesses are like elementals in that they're true manifestations of these almost like lower natures of our impulses, right? It's like our body, it's our nervous system, it's how we react to people, it's how we, when we say the thing that's like maybe kind of mean to somebody because we're frustrated, and then like hours later we're feeling guilt about that. That's the princess, that's the automatic reaction. And yet, and this is the gag, that in itself, in that embodiment, is the throne of the ace, is the throne of the godhead. So it's like nothing but God just working through the nervous system and doing its thing, and its own weird version of karma yoga. And yeah, it's fun. Yeah, Thoth really goes there. It's so fun.
Yeah, Thoth goes a lot of places that Rider-Waite-Smith doesn't go, and I'm grateful for that. And I often find that it's a little bit unfortunate that there aren't quite as many variations of the Thoth deck as there are the Rider-Waite-Smith. There are some. You mentioned Mel Moline, and you've got a picture behind you of her Fool, and I noticed the card, the box for Tabula Mundi and her Rosetta Tarot, but they're few and far between. And I'm not sure. I think that maybe it's just a little bit overwhelming for some people, perhaps, or they just want to keep it on the surface, I think.
Totally, yeah. And because I mean, it's hard to say. I think the Rider-Waite-Smith in a lot of ways is self-explanatory, and it's easier to have an artistic freedom with that. And the Thoth deck, there's just so much more to it. It's intimidating for a lot of people. But yet, but Mel Moline is, I mean, her mind, she's just wonderful. And she so much care and work into that deck. but it's like, yeah, you kind of have to approach something that
Yeah.
large.
Yeah. 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 Just as a side conversation here, do you have a copy of her new deck?
I don't yet.
No.
No,
No. Yeah.
I haven't gotten a new tarot deck in a long,
Oh,
long time, but
yeah.
hers is the next on my list. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have it. It's totally different.
Oh yeah, it looked
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Oh really? Oh, that's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
cool.
yeah. I'm not entirely sure how to work. I have a sense of how to work with it. I
Hmm.
think that it is intentionally more of a magical deck,
Hmm.
to do sort of tarot magic. And the symbolism is primarily based, I think, on I have it
The
behind me.
Picatrix maybe or
Yeah,
the
the Picatrix, yeah, for
okay.
the deacons, the imagery
Hmm.
on the deacons. So yeah, it's a fascinating deck. She's still writing the book for it. So
Okay.
I think that that's what she's working on this year. But
Cool.
yeah, and I find that interesting because that can take us to a whole different level of tarot mysticism.
Yeah.
Because, I think that what you did in your book is really amazing. And I felt a little bit bad because I think I read the book in a way that it shouldn't be read. I always read my guest books, and so I read a lot of books, and I have to kind of read them quickly, and I always try to time it so that I finish like a day or two before I speak to someone. And I felt that your book deserved a little bit more time to kind of sit with and absorb because you bring in so much and you do it in a very clear way. It's not confusing, but I think it is deserving of time.
Hmm. Thank you so much for reading it that fast. I could, it takes me very long to read books,
Yeah.
so I that's so impressive.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It took you what, 6 years to write, I think you said?
It did. It took me 6 years, but in that 6 years, there were three hyperfixations. So
Mm.
kind of three like series of several months that I was like writing it kind of profusely. So it wasn't like consistently 6 years. The first after I didn't even want to actually finish it. It's really funny, but
Yeah.
the universe had plans to finish it. So I'm glad that everything worked out that the way it did. And yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a great book and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this. And it seems to me that this isn't the final word. I mean, we just mentioned Mel Meline in her new book, but where do you go from here?
Like, what do I have coming up, or in terms of like content or my own mind, or where is that going? Or
Both. Yeah. I
okay.
mean, it seems like the exploring tarot on this level is a life's journey in some ways that, it's not like, oh, now I understand all these correspondences and where it goes on the tree of life. Let me rephrase the question and we'll come back to where it goes from here.
Mhm.
Maybe the question ought to be, how exactly would one work with the tarot in this sort of mystical approach?
Okay, that's a great question. So there's three ways, and I'm going to answer both those questions. So there's three ways, and the third way is where I am really looking to go next. So, and it corresponds to the three planes that I talk about in the book. So on the mechanical plane in level one, that's reading the cards. And so what that's it's just any like, normal way that you flip a card and interpret it and work with what's in front of you, work with what you know about the card and get a message for yourself or for somebody else if you're doing reading or if you're doing divination, looking at possibilities of what's coming. And so there's that level. Then there is the subtle level, which is where you're working not so much with a specific message or a divination, like you're getting it. It's more you're working with the symbols themselves or the associations themselves. So, for example, with the high priestess can represent your connection between Keterin and Tiferet, and so she represents this threshold between your higher self and unity. Now, how do you work with that? Well, and this is the challenge that a lot of people face when we're working with tarot at this level. It's really not about getting a specific result besides the knowledge itself.
Mm.
It's almost like, we don't listen to music to get to the end of the track, right? I think that's another thing I steal from Alan Watts.
Mm.
Like, we don't go to a movie to finish it, we enjoy it. So, working at on a subtle causal plane, it's just the knowledge itself. It's the map itself. Now, there are practical things you can do, like path working and meditation and magic. There are some exercises I have in the book that are supportive of different stages of knowledge, but it's really just the knowledge itself. Now, that knowledge can pour into divination. And what that does is the divination, you're just working with, I find, more sophisticated concepts that are not going to be necessarily an instant gratification, like, oh, my ex-boyfriend is going to text me back. Oh, I'm going to get that job. But it's an archetype, it's an energy, it's a pattern that you get to look at as a reflection of you and see where you sit in with that. It's that's a bit of a tougher sell, I will admit, though. But for a lot of people, I run something called the Tarot Mysticism Academy. We now have these 3 levels where we explore tarot in these 3 ways. So we have a level for divination specifically, reading the cards, and then we have this more advanced level, which is apprehending the self in these patterns, in these archetypes, in these associations. And what that does, it's just a deeper integration of self. It's kind of like seeing how you, as consciousness, are all of these things, and not judging it, but just beholding the diversity within you as a conscious being. Now, there's one more level to this, and this goes into the more mystical level, and this is where I'm kind of heading more towards, is when let's say, having apprehended all these archetypes, having noticed yourself in every card, in every symbol, in every association, what happens then? Well, maybe this is more of a better sell. When all of this comes together, it dissolves way it back into being, just like we talked about before with YHVH. That's mysticism. And that's where you recognize, and I think Lanma Luduket talks about this as well, the connections between everyone. Crowley talks about this in Libra 777. You recognize the connections between every one thing and every other thing. Now, I would go a step further, and this is coming from, this is very Advaita Vedanta heavy, what I'm about to say, but then the big gag at the end of the day, the big kicker is, you are that. You are it. Back into the mystical mic drop. And that to me is the most important thing, because at that level, when everything collapses and you're it, there's nothing you can lose. There's no there's nothing left to be said, and there's no suffering there. So, I've worked with, I run Tarot Mysticism Academy. I've been in the New Age and spiritual communities for, many years, and I see so many people are drawn to these things because of their suffering, of their neuroses, of things psychologically, some things worldly too, whatever, like finances, family, all this. There's just so much. And I've been in personal growth circles. I've been in business mastermind circles. There's so much out there to do to better oneself, but I have found that nothing ultimately scratches the itch until you just come back into being. That is the only thing I've found to truly scratch that itch and be like at the deepest, most ontological level of okayness, true okayness. And so that's where I'm headed full speed ahead as far as I can go. We'll see what happens. But and that's what we do at the Academy too. There's a level we're now exploring, and we're kind of doing some more advanced programs on that, but it's very tough to communicate. It's more of just it's more of a release rather than a doing. And that's not always as attractive to people.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that quite a bit. I'm trying to find a quote here, which I just found, because what you said is, for me, kind of the heart of spirituality. And the way I always phrase this, and I get asked this by students a lot, since I teach religious studies and philosophy, they always think in terms of finding meaning. And what I do is I counter. There's a quote by Joseph Campbell, and I think this is in his interviews that he did with Bill Moyers, where he says, no, it's not about finding meaning. And he comes from the approach that there is no necessarily inherent meaning to anything, that we create the meaning. And that can be debated. But what he says is what most people are actually looking for is the feeling of being present to their own lives. And I think it's that being present to ourselves and being present to that life force, whatever it is, that greater mystery that we are a part of. And one of the things you wrote at the very beginning of the book, and a definition of tarot, was that it's a permission slip for presence. Tarot, like any form of mysticism, facilitates our presence with ourselves and our world.
Yeah. I'm so glad you shared that with about Joseph Campbell. I love that. Yeah, absolutely, right? It is that because like even in whatever the thing is that like excites us, that turns us on, that we have a great day. What is that
Yeah.
feeling of the great day of that like or love? It's that it comes it's a release of the tension of the search for presence, and then in presence it's like there it is.
Yeah.
But then there's not a great deal of content in that presence necessarily, or if there is, it's not apart from us. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really what
Yeah.
it's about.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that. That was so
Yeah.
fun. I
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
look at
Well, I'm
that.
glad I had that quote written down. Kind
Yeah.
of brought us to where we needed to be, I think. So, all right. So the going back to the question that I kind of deviated from, what do you have coming next? Where are you going from here? What are you
Yeah.
working on now?
So I'm changing a lot. I will say one thing that I do every year is I teach at something called Anahata's Purpose, which is an
Mm,
amazing retreat that involves a lot of facilitators on various levels of personal growth, magic. There's some witchiness, there's a lot of wellness, yoga, drumming, all different kind of things that are connected to wellness in the heart. That's an amazing event. So I'll definitely be there. That usually happens in September. I'll be at Convocation as well, which is I've never been before, but I'm gonna do some lecturing there. I would say in terms of what I'm doing independently, I run something called Tarot Mysticism Academy, which has grown a lot, and it's a curriculum around the esoteric tarot and teaches all these different topics like Kabbalah, astrology, and hermeticism, and energy healing, and it's very emphasizes personal growth through these matters. And so I'll be doing that. That's going through a lot of changes. We're kind of growing that, and that's shifting a lot. I'm starting a new mastermind. So another thing I do, this is my this is my Capricorn stellium that does this, is I run a mastermind where I help other spiritual businesses either start or grow. So
mm,
tarot readers, healers, any kind of practitioners, and I essentially teach them to do what I did, which is take my passion and turn it into a career, not just a career, but like a thriving career, which is, it's been a wild ride doing that. But that is one of my favorite things to do. So that is kind of in development and growing. And I get to work with some amazing people in all different fields like tarot, personal growth, coaching,
mm.
and we get to connect and grow our businesses together. And that's really fun. But I do think in general, what I'm kind of shifting into, and I think my content will start to reflect this in the near future. Oh, YouTube is definitely the place. I'll be doing more
Okay.
content on YouTube. So youtube.com/Joe Monteleone. There's a lot of free classes there and lectures and a bunch of stuff. I think I'm going to be doing more content on non-duality
Mm,
and exploring that mystical plane. And I want to get that glimpse to as many people as
yeah.
I can, that singularity, that point of no return. Because after that, there's just no, there's
Yeah.
that's it. There's nowhere else to go. It's the best. I think it's the most fun thing ever, or the most fun non-thing rather. But yeah,
Okay. And what's the website for the Tarot Mysticism Academy? Is it just tarotmysticismacademy.com?
yep, that's it.
Okay, perfect. All right. I will put links for that and I'll see if I can get the YouTube in there as well and links for your book as well. And when does the book come out? I had a advanced copy of it. When is it set to
Yeah,
publish?
it's out now.
Oh, is
So
it? Okay.
yeah, I think it on Amazon it released January 8th, but I think the
Okay.
publisher released it earlier than that. So yeah, it's
Okay.
on everywhere books are sold, Amazon, Books a Million, Barnes and Noble, the Llewellyn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put links in for the book as well. So, Joe, I really appreciated this conversation. I love geeking out about tarot with people, and I love the mystical aspect and the esoteric aspect. It's one of my great passions. So, I've been looking forward to this conversation. And again, I really enjoyed the book. So, I encourage people who have an interest in this to get the book and check out your YouTube channel and your classes.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was such an honor being here and getting to hang out with you and your awesome mind. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that's a wrap on episode 184 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience. Now, all my faithful listeners, my Rebel Spirits, know what's coming up next. All the usual. Sign up for my Patreon, share this with friends and family and on social media too, please. Subscribe or follow the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. I know you know the drill. But the thing is, all that is really important. Sharing, subscribing, or following, they're all free, and it only takes a few seconds of your time, and they really do help. Subscriber numbers are important, as are followers on podcast platforms. Right now, putting together this podcast is a labor of love, and I do love it. A lot of work goes into creating each episode, several hours every week. I'm in the process of making changes to improve the podcast and the YouTube channel. It's slow going. I think you realize that. But your support will help me speed up the process and ensure that I can continue with the podcast and offer much more content than what I provide now. As I always say, I'm here on the front range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality and ecology, consciousness, and the esoteric, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the Rebel Spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts to share the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be at peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.